And we're live, the Gio and Joey show. Joey, how you doing today?
Doing better than I deserve.
Amen. Brother stole my line. Now I can't even say it anymore. Hey, look, I like the show you have lined up for us. We're going to be talking some old Biden clip. We're going to be talking some Christian nationalism. You have some quotes from us. But give us an overview, right, of exactly what we're going to be looking at and why you decided to produce this show today.
Yeah, so there's a clip that's floating around from MSNBC of this liberal journalist decided she wanted to get up and tell everyone what Christian nationalism is and what's so their dangerous, insidious belief that makes someone a Christian nationalist. And the problem with it is, I watch this. I'm like, I don't think of myself as a Christian nationalist. In fact, I have certain issues with Christian nationalism. But then I
Hmm.
watch this clip, and I'm like, oh, apparently I'm a Christian nationalist, and apparently so is like everyone from American political life for like all of time until like 5 minutes ago.
You know,
So
it's funny you mentioned that because I remember when we were going through the COVID things, it got to a point where, like, for example, my wife and I did not get vaccinated for COVID. However, we're not anti vaccine, right? Our kids are vaccinated. I have certain vaccines, but we pick and choose what we want, and we didn't feel comfortable with the COVID vaccine. And time has bared it out that we were correct. Well, it got to a point where on Twitter and even one of these online dictionaries where you were considered anti-vaxxer if you did not get the COVID vaccination. In other words, you could have gotten other vaccines, but if you didn't get this COVID one, you were labeled a total anti-vaxxer. And it's the same thing. Before we point the clip, though, you brought up a point. Why are we against Christian nationalism in the way we understand it?
yeah, so I mean, the biggest thing is because what some people will say is they're like, wait, you're a Christian, you're conservative politically, right? You want the government to have laws generally based on Christian morality. Now it's more complicated than that. The part of morality, right, that's the natural law that everyone can
Mm-hmm.
understand. But to say, so why aren't you a Christian nationalist? Well, I think part of the problem is the term Christian nationalism, first of all, was originally developed as a slur used by liberals and leftists against conservative Christians. Then I think it started with like Marjorie Taylor Greene, and some people decided to adopt the term and decided to kind of develop this ideology, which in a lot of ways is against the Christian foundations of this country in the sense that this was founded as like a specifically Protestant country where religious freedom was the bedrock principle. And there's certain Christian nationalists now who think that they look at the state of society and they say, we have to get back to God, therefore we're going to use the law to do that. Well, we've talked about this before, but like whenever a church or a religion needs the power of the state, like Ben Franklin said, he
Mm-hmm.
perceives that would be a bad religion. And I don't think that the gospel, I don't think that the Church of Jesus Christ needs the power of the state to enforce religious dogma.
Yeah, and for me, the way I like to put it, and I've said it before on the program, is the issue of liberty of conscience, right? I want this country to have Christian morals. I want this country to behave the way the Bible tells us to behave. Nevertheless, I don't want to use the power of the state to do that. I want it to be by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. I want it to be by persuasion of the fact that those of us who live a life following Christ are come across as attractive to people and people who want to follow us. However, there is the other side of the video we're going to watch that is broadly painting everybody as a Christian nationalist when we're not. And when you broadly paint people as a Christian nationalist, then you begin to confuse people, and that's not good for anybody. And then that becomes an issue where then the ignorant are then pointing to everybody as that which you and I are against. We are against true Christian nationalists, people who would want to use the sword to enforce Christian morality. And that's not us, but the way she paints it. And let's watch this video now, unless you got a comment before we put it on.
Yeah, so I was just gonna say, right, sometimes there's a false dichotomy that's painted, right? Like you're either a Christian nationalist or you want a secular public square. Those two things actually are not true, right? In other words,
They're not mutually
secularism,
exclusive.
yeah, they don't necessarily like they you can you don't have to believe either of those, right? Um Secularism, there's nothing inherent in secularism that would insist upon religious liberty. Right? In other words, the principles of religious liberty that we see in our First Amendment were put there by devout Protestant Christians. That's where it comes from. So even like in my defense of like American constitutionalism, it is a kind of Christian society, right? The way we used to say before the whole Christian nationalism debate, I may have used the term Christian nation before it had that association. But what I meant and what conservatives have typically meant is kind of Judeo Christian civilization, the outpourings of that. And so, like, no, I'm not arguing for secularism. It's just the proper role of the church and state being separate.
Yes. Funny that I should mention this, but remember a while ago we did a video on Eric Adams, the mayor of New York City, and he made some good points there. Just because I don't want to enforce my religion on people does not mean that I don't want my religion to have a voice in the public square. It's just I'm not going to use force. I think our way of understanding life, our worldview, it would be best for the nation. But it's not going to be used at the penalty of throwing people in jail or the sword or coercive measures. It should be persuasion. Let's watch this video and then we'll talk about it.
Right? Remember when Trump ran in 2016, a lot of the mainline evangelicals wanted nothing to do with the divorced, real estate mogul who had cheated on his wife and with a porn star and all of that, right? So what happened was he was surrounded by this more extremist element. You're going to hear words like Christian nationalism, like the new apostolic reformation. These are groups that you should get very schooled on because they have a lot of power in Trump's circle. And the one thing that unites all of them, because there's many different groups orbiting Trump, but the thing that unites them as Christian nationalists, not Christians, by the way, because Christian nationalists is very different, is that they believe that our rights as Americans, as all human beings, don't come from any earthly authority. They don't come from Congress. They don't come from the Supreme Court. They come from God. The problem with that is that they are determining men, it is men, are determining what God is telling them. And in the past, that so-called natural law is, it's a pillar of Catholicism. Catholicism, for instance, it's been used for good in social justice campaigns. Martin Luther King evoked it in talking about civil rights. But now you have an extremist element of conservative Christians who say that this applies specifically to issues including abortion, gay marriage, and it's going much further than that, as you see, for instance, with the ruling in Alabama this week. That judge is connected to that dominionist faction.
Let me ask you a question.
Well, apparently I'm a Christian nationalist. I didn't know it.
Yeah, well, isn't the Bill of Rights start with?
Well, the Declaration of Independence, right?
Yeah,
is like endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights.
Yes, inalienable rights. So yes, it doesn't depend on man. Yes, because look, if it depended on man, then man can take them away. And that's the problem with it being dependent on man. If man decided once again that, let's say this time, Asians should be slaves, then man can decide that if our rights came from man. But our rights do not come from men. And so this lady just needs to do a little bit more broader reading. Your thoughts, what caught your attention in the video?
Yeah, I love how she tries to make that distinction there. She's like, well, there's Christians and there's Christian nationalists, which true enough distinction. But then her point is, the Christian nationalists believe your rights come from God. I'm like, where else do they come from, right? And the one thing that's interesting about this is the more honest, I don't know what her religious background is, because she did praise some Christian activists, so it wasn't completely nonsense, but that part was nonsense. But the more honest, like secularists and atheists, like Yuval Noah Harari, which is kind of he's the chief philosopher of like the WEF crowd, and he literally has said, listen, our rights, these are just fictions that we tell ourselves, right? Because he's like religion, like God, rights are just another fiction that we tell ourselves, but there's no scientific validity to them. And if your worldview is merely scientific, then that's a big deal. For us, we're like, well, sure, you can't prove it. You can't dissect someone and see their rights. But you know from what human beings are, creatures made in the image of God, that they have them, right? Because of the type of creature we are.
Yeah, and this is scary because you see this on the left more often, right? Where they try to paint everybody in one broad stroke. And it's lack of intelligence, really, when you can't talk in nuance, in terms that differentiate between, the Christian nationalists and Christians, and not knowing that even Christians, right, we recognize that our rights come from God. And it's interesting that we have another video here of somebody who understood that. Why don't you set the stage for that other video?
Well, so I actually saw this clip on Michael Knowles' show at the Daily Wire today. And the point he brought out that I thought was interesting, right, and kind of funny, was he was like, listen, so there's these woke youngsters on the left, and they're trying to make up all sorts of things. The problem is their president, the president of their party, is so old, he actually knew Thomas Jefferson, right? And so he knew the people who wrote these things. And so for every kind of crazy woke thing they say, there's a clip of Joe Biden saying the opposite. And listen, I have plenty of disagreements with Joe Biden. I think he's been a lackluster president, to say that's the best I could say about him. But the thing that this clip illustrates is the thing that we're talking about. This isn't some radical Christian nationalist modern thing. Like, this is just how Americans used to see ourselves, how we used to see our rights, like universally. And I think part of the problem is the fact that we got rid of civic education, right? So kids don't actually know that our Declaration of Independence literally says that our rights come from our Creator, right? Because they don't know that, they think like, oh, God has no place in public life. Well, that's never been true, right? The whole idea of religious freedom, like, why should I respect your right to religious freedom other than you were created by God with a conscience, and therefore it's wrong of me to violate that? So yeah, we can play this clip of old Uncle Joe Biden.
I saw a quick SNL clip. It's a short on YouTube, and it was talking about Hunter Biden and the fact, it must be a little bit old, but it was talking about that Hunter Biden may spend anywhere between, if convicted, between 5 to 10 years in jail. Will have to serve a sentence that's 5 to 10 years. And if he does, it will be the first time a Biden has completed a sentence in a long time. Because Sleepy Joe is out of it. So look, let's listen
but
to
hey,
with
this clip, Joe's right on the money. He's right on the money with this one.
Yeah. Well, then again, though, this clip is when he was still here with us mentally. This clip is a little old, so let's watch it.
All Americans are born with certain inalienable rights. As a child of God, I believe my rights are not derived from the Constitution. My rights are not derived from any government. My rights are not derived from any majority. My rights are because I exist. I have certain rights. That they're given to me and each of my fellow citizens by our Creator, and they represent the essence of human dignity.
Right? And that's the point. Joe understood that, because that's the reality. And here's the thing. Look, I'm not opposed to people changing their views, growing in their understanding of life and understanding of things. I myself spent 12 years away from God, and now I understand God better and understand life better. But when you go from a universal truth to now some lower sense of truth, when you can compare the two views and say, wait a minute, this makes more sense, that's when you know you're drinking the Kool-Aid or smoking something, because the views of society are degrading. They're not uplifting. They're going the wrong direction. And we see it in that MSNBC clip, because even Sleepy Joe knew what was right.
Yeah, no, exactly. And obviously we don't have this clip, but the whole thing with like gay marriage, right? That was another conversation that happened because Michael Knowles' speech this week. And the Biden team, they tweeted out Michael, and they tweeted out like, "This is Trump Republicans." And then Michael just retweeted a clip of Biden from 2004, where Biden was like stridently defending the fact that marriage is between a man and a woman, and he's like, "What's up, Jack? Nobody wants to change that." And so it's like, for even having the position that Joe Biden, right, or Barack Obama had, right, 15, 16 years ago, now that's supposed to be some sort of radical Christian nationalist position.
And like I mentioned just a second ago, when views begin to decay, when we begin to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, that men can menstruate, that women can be men, that men can compete in women's sports and it be equal, we have lost all sense of normalcy. We have lost all sense of decorum, all sense. Can you imagine our founding fathers having to deal with this? I mean,
I don't think they would. I don't think they'd tolerate it, to be honest.
No, yes. And it's a shame on us society today that we tolerate this nonsense. And a matter of fact, I saw, because I haven't been feeling well, so I've been laying in bed, a short from The View. And once again, this notion of painting everybody in a broad brush and fear mongering, right? People accuse Republicans, or I don't want to even use political parties, but conservative people of fear mongering, right? But everything we have supposedly fear mongered about has come to fruition. So we're prognosticators, not fear mongering. Well, anyway, Whoopi Goldberg on The View said, if we vote for conservatives, they're going to have concentration camps and round up the gay people, and we'll lose all sense of democracy, and we will be living in concentration camps. Like, what on earth are these people smoking? Right? It's all fear-based fear-mongering, and yet the masses seem to buy into it. Your thoughts on that?
Well, it's the thing about demagoguery, right? Is if you can paint your opponents as the worst, most existential threat ever, that then excuses you to cross over boundaries to stop them, right? And so, listen, I think this is more of a problem on the left, but this can be a problem on both sides when we pretend like if our side loses the next election, then there's never going to be another one, right? Like that kind of language only, listen, I don't particularly like either of the leading candidates. I don't think the Constitution or the country is going to end just because Joe Biden or Donald Trump are elected president. Like, I think our system can withstand a bad president. I think our system, like, we may go through some dark times, but I'm not catastrophic in that way.
Right? You agree with Ann's statement there that we got on the screen? They're the fearmongers, not conservatives. Exactly. And, we have to, sometimes being conservative, it's like swimming upstream, because when they control the media, when they control social media, when they control the narrative, Hollywood, movies, only now are conservatives fighting back. man, it gets tiresome having to deal. And the problem then becomes that us conservatives, uh, the fact that we believe that we want independence and freedom and religious liberty sometimes works against us, right? Because all we want is just leave me alone, right? But by taking that attitude of leave me alone, sometimes we concede too much in the public square. And now, because many conservatives who are balanced, who do not want to use the force of the state to enforce religion, are speaking up, though, and not being quiet and submissive, now everybody's a Christian nationalist. And that's where the fear mongering begins.
Yeah, and part of the reason I think why this clip blew up so much of that silly MSNBC lady saying if you believe your rights come from God, not government, that makes you a Christian nationalist, is because this is actually a foundational point to our country, right? Not Christian nationalists, but just the idea is it starts with God, right? All truth, right? In other words, truth builds on itself, right? And so there are more fundamental and foundational truths than others. Well, whether or not there's a God, right, that's the most fundamental truth, right? So a lot of other things rest upon that. And so understanding this correctly actually goes to the point of solving many of the other problems in society, right? So I think a lot of times conservatives are fighting fires because we're trying to deal with all the craziness that the left has, right? Men can become women, right? Men should play in women's sports, right? Blah, blah, all these different crazy things. But I think if we go back to the foundation, go back to the basics, right? Our buddy Dennis is always talking about like it all comes down to discipleship is the number one thing, right? In other words, if we're doing that, if we're letting people know who God is and therefore who they are in relation to him, that solves a lot of the other problems, right? Well, then you can understand why the unborn matter and you shouldn't kill them. Then you should understand why as a man, you shouldn't abandon the mother of your children and your children, right? Then you can understand why, you shouldn't mutilate your body because you don't feel like the sex that you clearly are, right? Once you understand that God, right, exists, that he made you, that there's an order and a purpose to the cosmos and to our world, everything else flows from that. And including, right, our rights and like the things in our constitution, that's just codifying what they could observe about human nature based on the fact that there was a creator.
And has a good comment here that I'll put there. Can you read it? Can you see it? It says nobody does their own research, and whatever is the most prominently pushed agenda is what's viewed as true solely because it's popular, and that is exactly the problem. People don't think for themselves. People do not. They want to be told what to believe instead of finding what they believe for themselves. And when you look internally without a compass, like let's say the Word of God, then you are tossed to and fro, right? I mean, we're in a society today that a kid can't get a tattoo without parental permission, yet they can go behind their parents' back, get an abortion, or start hormone therapy, or things like that. And it's a world that it's upside down, and sometimes conservatives are so taken aback by the foolishness that I remember when this foolishness was starting, that I was like, "You're joking, right? Like you're not serious." It took me aback, right? It took me like a split second to realize, no, these fools are serious, and that's where we have to start educating ourselves and our kids and our nieces and nephews, and not just assume. Well, don't get me started with public schools and elementaries, right? Homeschool your kids if you can, really.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. But I like I said, I just want to like getting that fundamental truth, I think will solve so much else. Obviously not everything, right? We still got to get the doctrine, right? Because there's some Christians have gone in some wacky directions as well. But it'll go such a long way in fixing the madness.
Let's
But
look at. Go ahead.
yeah. No, I was just going to say, yeah, we got some quotes here.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go to. Let's
To
go
show
to the
the
quotes.
Christian nationalist foundations of the country. I say that in
Go
scare
ahead.
quotes. Yeah, so I'll just read this one here. This is by Thomas Jefferson. It says, "But our rulers can have authority over such natural rights only as we have submitted to them. The rights of conscience we never submitted. We could not submit. We are answerable for them to our God. The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others. But it does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither pricks my pocket nor breaks my leg. If it be said his testimony in a court of justice cannot be relied on, reject it then, and be the stigma on him. Constraint may make him worse by making him a hypocrite, but it will never make him a truer man. It may fix him obstinately in his errors, but will not cure them. Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error."
And that
So yeah,
go ahead.
and here's the thing: Thomas Jefferson was on the more liberal side of the founders, and even he is saying, like, listen, this whole like free exercise of ideas and whatnot, it's predicated right on the foundational belief that our Creator gives us such rights. And listen, we subject ourselves to government, right? Like that first part of what he's saying. We all agree to limit ourselves in some ways by living under a government. That's just part of the contract of existing in a society. But I like what he said there. Is like, but when it comes to this right of conscience, right, we could never submit that, right? And I think of the famous line by Martin Luther when he was the kind of kicking off, right, in the Diet of Worms, kicking off the Protestant Reformation. He says, "Listen, if you could be proven that I was wrong, I'd recant. But if not, I can't recant. Like, so help me God, right? I can do no other, right?" And so this right of conscience is so fundamental, but it comes down to, right, God. And I think part of what's happened with secular liberals and secular leftists today is they're trying to keep the freedoms, they're trying to keep the rights, but they don't want to have any conversation about where they come from. And listen, I think it's kind of like your car, once it runs out of gas, will keep running a little bit on the fumes. And I think that's kind of been the case in our society, where it's like we can kind of exist with these rights for a while, but eventually it breaks down. Eventually, right, if we don't know where the rights come from, we start discarding things. And so that's why it's so important to remember the foundational truth.
Something about this quote, that last line that I really resonates with me. It says, "Reason and free inquiry are the only effectual agents against error." And that's part of my issue during the COVID pandemic. And I bring that up again only because it's indicative of the entire liberal side, right? Is that truth should never be afraid of scrutiny. Truth should never be afraid of digging deeper. And I remember early on during the pandemic, man, if you had any question about the vaccine or about the treatment or about COVID, they tried to shut you down or shout you down, right? They didn't want to listen to everybody. And obviously we know now that Facebook and back then Twitter, before it was owned by Elon Musk, was censoring people. And now we know that those people who took that narrative, hook, line, and sinker, some of them are suffering with the ill effects of the vaccine. And so that's why you should always be true to your conscience, even if no one else is standing with you. That's why liberty of conscience is so important. And that's why liberty of conscience is something you should hold valuable. And it's something that we should fight for, and it's something we fight for here on the Gio and Joey show. We may not always agree. We may not always agree with your stance, but we will always, always fight for your right to state your opinion.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And to that point, this is a specifically Christian thing. So sometimes people try to pit, right, kind of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment against Christianity. but there's a reason why it happened in the West, right? Because this idea of reason and free inquiry being the way that we can like fight against error, right? That's actually a Christian idea, right? So in Christianity, right, it's God who says, "Come now, let us reason together." But this is actually a point in Islam where this is a point that even like imams will make, right? If Allah were to say and were to have said, right, that idolatry was right, then it would be right. But it's only wrong because Allah says it's wrong. Where in Christianity, that's not true. Right? In other words, God created the universe to work a certain way, and so when He says to do something, right, it's because He's observing that that's the best way for society to work. So in other words, reason then follows, right? So in other words, that's why we can have a natural law in Christianity, because we can assume, okay, the universe works a certain way, so therefore we should be able to derive rules from the way the universe works that tells us how to live. Right? That's not the same in other religions. So so
God,
all of this, yeah.
No, go ahead. Finish your thought.
So I'm just gonna say, yeah, all of this again rests on a Christian notion, right? So that's why I want to stress, right? There's Christians and there's conservatives engaging in a Christian way in politics, and we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't be apologetic about that, right? But that's different than Christian nationalism, and we shouldn't paint everything with a broad brush.
Exactly, but that's what the left likes to do. They want to paint everything with a broad brush. And God, when properly understood, you understand that He's not arbitrary, right? He's not making up rules just for the sake of making up rules. He knows what's best for the flourishing of the individual and for the flourishing of society. And as we undermine those principles, as we cut away the foundation of those principles, for example, I think I heard it first in one of the Daily Wire guys talking about what Hawaii, the spirit of Oahu or Oahu or whatever, that says does away with the Constitution. So why can't then the spirit of Oahu do away with Christianity or conservatives or anything, right? Once you start going to foundational principles that aren't grounded on natural law, whether you believe in Christianity or not, those inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence, then you start getting where man decides who. And we saw how evil man can get during the COVID, right? They were calling grandma killers and second-class citizens. So that's the scary thing that we have to, the Gio and Joey show are fighting against. We want everybody to live under the same rights. And then we have persuasion to get us to more ideals. Let's look at the second quote. Go ahead.
So hopefully everyone recognizes this quote. I would hope. But this is from our one of our founding documents. It says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And obviously that's from the Declaration.
Yeah,
and
you know
sorry, MSNBC lady, but it's right there.
Yeah, you know what's funny about this quote? And it has nothing to do with this quote, but there was a video going viral in the last 2 weeks of a young lady who was interviewing a heavyset African-American musician, where she said, "You're a musician," and the lady was like, "I'm not a musician. I do music." And I take it that the young lady was thinking she said, "You're a magician." And so the reason I bring that up is that people don't even know nuance, right? They don't even know vocabulary. And so I could picture someone like that saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," and then coming back and saying, "But what about women? Right? Are not women created equal?" And it's this notion that understand the language, understand what it means, right? This is talking about all of us are created equal. And so as society degrades, we begin to see foolishness, And maybe they don't say that, but when you don't understand the word musician, and when others are making comments that, yes, pregnant people. No, you mean women who can get pregnant, right? When they don't understand those fine principles, then society becomes uh, the twilight zone, really.
Well, and part of the problem too is we want to throw out, right? If we can look at someone and they didn't live out their principles perfectly, we want to throw out everything they did. So, like, somebody could look at it and they're like, listen, the men who wrote that line owned slaves. So it's like, so therefore they, I guess, or whatever. But here's the thing, the logic that they were articulating here, the logic that built this country, is the logic that led to the abolition of slavery, right? In other words,
Yes.
they laid the premises that future generations enacted. And here's the thing, all of the actual civil rights leaders, like a lot of the BLM nonsense people that are on news now, they're not civil rights leaders. But the actual civil rights leaders, Frederick Douglass, Booker T. Washington, Dr. King, right? Like, these guys, what were they actually doing, right? Were they saying, hey, let's tear down this system? No, they were saying, listen, you see that? I think Dr. King called it a promissory note, right? And he said,
Yes.
we want to cash in on this promissory note, right? Frederick Douglass said, listen, these are great ideas. Let us in on it, right? So in other words, they were appealing to these ideas upon which the system was built and saying, listen, as Americans, right, grant us our right, grant us, like, fulfill the promise that you made. And so that's one thing. Listen, Andrew Klavan has joked in his opening monologue about this black national anthem thing, and he had a funny line. He's like, listen, I always thought black people were Americans, right? And that they should be given the same rights as us, but they're saying they belong to some other country. So I guess if they belong to Blackistan, right, they can't make a claim on the Constitution of the United States, right? And it's obviously funny, right? But
It's
that's the whole
satire.
thing.
Yeah.
Like, when you separate, the serious point though is like, listen, like, there's Blackistan, right? There's this country that's represented by the Black National Anthem, and then there's this country that's represented by the Star Spangled Banner, right? And listen, this country is built upon these constitutional rights, these natural rights that come from natural law. This other country is built upon racial grievance, right? In other words, these are two different founding principles. And I would say my black friends, they identify over here with the Constitution, right? So I don't know. That's just something that I was thinking of is,
Another
where
thing,
do our principles come from and where
yeah,
are they going to lead to?
another issue I have is that people love, for example, there's an example, and I'm going to use a Bible example. When Jesus comes out of the boat and the demons say, I know who you are. You're the Holy Son of God. Have you come to destroy us before the time? People do not know how to differentiate between truth and the person uttering the truth. For example, am I going to deny that statement simply because a demon said it? Right? The demon spoke the truth. You are the Son of God. And even though our founding fathers had slaves, forget, you who has no sin, cast the first stone. Forget their personal lives. What did they write? And when you look at the principles of what they wrote, I mean, it's the greatest document any nation here on earth has ever seen. It gives the liberals their right to complain. It gives people the right to assemble and protest, right? But it has to be done within the context of reality. And many people are living now in a context that it's basically the twilight zone is what I call it. They're not living in reality anymore. And that's what makes, what's that quote that I love and I always forget it? The one about that the Constitution was made for just and moral people.
Moral and religious people, and is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. John Adams.
Yes, and we're seeing it, right? People, and the Bible has a similar principle in Romans chapter 8, where it says, those who are carnal cannot keep the law, right? They're not even subject to the law, right? because they're not even reasoning correctly. And that's what we see. Let's look at this other quote here. Go ahead.
So this is from my favorite president, the original, the OG of American presidents, George Washington, in a letter to Samuel Langdon. He said, "The man must be bad indeed who can look upon the events of the American Revolution without feeling the warmest gratitude towards the great author of the universe, whose divine interposition was so frequently manifested in our behalf." Right? So, again, this is just going to kind of what originally, this is actually the first quote that I thought of. I had been reading some stuff on Washington when I saw that clip, right, where she's trying to say, like, that our rights don't come from God or whatever. I'm like, well, you gotta disagree then with the guy who literally kind of founded this whole thing, right? The reason why we don't have a monarchy here, right? George Washington, he's saying, like, listen, God had a hand in forming this country. And I 100% believe that. And listen, while I believe that, and maybe we'll get into this another time when we talk about prophecy, but listen, I believe that ultimately, before Jesus comes, freedom is going to be lost for a time. But I think as Christians, we should be on the vanguard of saying, Andrew Clavin's got this other thing, right? If the ship of America and America's thing ever goes down, it may go down, the last thing you'll see is his hand grasping the ship, right? And so that should be Christians. But I believe that God, right, picked out this nation so that truth could spread, right? In other words, I believe we're living in the end times of Earth's history, but I believe that this country, more than any other, has been responsible for the free proclamation of the Word of God. The principles of freedom that we have here have allowed the truth of God's Word to spread like never before, right? The information technology that has started because of American capitalism has spread, right? It's how we're talking right now, right? You're in Texas, I'm in Michigan. It's like we're in the same room, right? But, like, listen, I believe God rose this country up to be a kind of bastion of freedom, right? In other words, there was the religious war, right? Because obviously, for the first 300 years of church history, Christians were a persecuted minority and they spread the gospel like never before. Then they got political power, right? Kind of the original Christian nationalists. They got Christian power and they decided, hey, now we're going to enforce it, right? And so then what did we see? We saw the Middle Ages and the barbarity of the Dark Ages, right? Right. Obviously, there was the religious warfare of Islam, but also of Christianity, right? And then it was Catholics versus Protestants killing each other, right? And that was the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War. And, finally, it culminated, right, in that this time people came here for religious freedom, Christians, and they decided, listen, we have a right to worship God according to the dictates of our conscience. And for the last 250 some years, this country has been the bastion of that liberty, right? And like I said, the missionary work, I was reading an article recently about the number of missionaries that have gone out from the United States. It's innumerable. There's no parallel to it. And so that's what I believe, has been God's ordained role for this country. And as Christians, let's continue to preach the gospel, that first and foremost, and defend the rights that have allowed us to do so.
And you mentioned earlier about perhaps one day we'll do something on prophecy. You look at whether you understand prophecy or not, right? If you just go home tonight, to those who are listening, and read Revelation chapters 13 and 14, regardless of whether you understand the dragon and the beast and the second beast and the three angels and all that, what you will pick up is that there is one power, the dragon and the beast and all that, who want to curtail liberty and force people not to be able to buy or sell, capitalism, right, under the threat of death. Now ask yourself, who does that sound like? Our liberal friends. We saw a mini glimpse of that during COVID, right? They wanted to exclude people. They wanted to, some of them you see videos of talking about putting some of us in camps and and not being able to get out our house. And that spirit that we saw in a tiny glimpse is going to be magnified as the nation heads down a path it should not. But those of us who love the truth, even though we are going to be hated for the truth, need to stand up for the truth no matter what. Let's look at this last quote.
This was also George Washington. He says, "May the same wonder-working deity who long since delivering the Hebrews from their Egyptian oppressors planted them in the promised land, whose providential agency has lately been conspicuous in establishing these United States as an independent nation, still continue to water them with the dews of heaven, and to make the inhabitants of every denomination participate in the temporal and spiritual blessings of that people whose God is Jehovah." Okay, so, like I said, I think like when people who want to deny the Christian influence upon the founding, there's a lot you have to ignore. It's there, right? Like all throughout the founders' writings, they invoke this idea of God, right? And the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of the apostles, right? In other words, so it is the Christian God. Obviously, he's talking there to, I believe it's a synagogue, but so like the Judeo-Christian foundations, but that is the only idea upon which we can derive the principles that are laid out in our Constitution, right? In other words, listen, like I can say, I believe, I guess an atheist can say, I believe in free speech, I believe in freedom of religion, I believe in the Second Amendment. But like, it's just that. It's just a belief.
Yeah,
But
it's not
when
grounded on anything.
Exactly. And so if it's just a belief, well, if the paper gives it to you, well, all you have to do is change the paper, right? Amend it, and it's not there. But what we would say is that if the government were to amend away these rights, right, in the law, well, then we could objectively say, no, that's wrong. The government is wrong to do this, and it is no longer a just government, right? Thomas Jefferson, right, would say, like, listen, if the government does that, if the government violates these rights, it ceases to have the authority, the legitimate authority of a government, right? Because we instituted governments to protect our rights, right, and to defend human freedom. And when they go against that, right, now, revolt becomes justified. I'm not
And
calling
that's,
for,
yeah,
but
exactly. But that's where the importance of, the Second Amendment comes in, and the First Amendment, right? The freedom of religion and the freedom of the press and all that. We have to be diligent, because if we're not diligent, it's taken from us. And we, for too long, have had, and I'm talking about the conservative party, those of us with morals and principles. For too long, we were content with, all right, you're leaving me alone. You're not entering my world. You do you. But now they seem to have taken over the institutions, and that's where it gets dangerous. And that's where we have to be careful that we continue to fight the good, the good fight. The good fight.
Amen.
Yeah, there's this comment here. What do you think of this comment?
The only thing that keeps a government going is the confidence of its people. No, that's exactly true, right? It's the idea of the consent of the governed. And that's actually part of the crisis that I think we're in right now, is our government and many of our institutions that I think we need, but they've squandered their credibility, right? Like you brought up COVID earlier. How many times, like, it would be one thing. Like I could understand, right? The government's full of people. I could understand a once in a lifetime, a once in a generation pandemic coming and them making mistakes. That I could understand. But they would go from one news conference to the next and just lie. They'd gaslight. They wouldn't say, like Anthony Fauci wouldn't say, hey, I was wrong earlier. He would just amend his position and say the new position as though that's the only thing he'd been saying. And then if anybody said that they agreed with what he said before, they'd be like, oh, well, you're a conspiracy theorist. So in other words, they couldn't be honest, right? And that's just one example of this squandering of credibility. But it's happened on a lot of different issues, right? From the border, from COVID, from public health, from big farm, like all these different issues where our leaders that we need to act with virtue have just squandered their credibility, and so people don't trust them. And listen, that is that leads to some dangers for democracies. Like, what happens then when the people no longer trust their government?
Here's what happens. Here's what happens when the people no longer trust their government. And we're going to wrap up here because I have a meeting here coming up. But here's what happens when the people don't trust their government. They start going to extremes. And I have always said on this show and in private conversations, the pendulum, unfortunately, is going to swing the other way. And the danger of those of us who want to hold on to the truth is that when the momentum is on our side, don't go to the extreme either, right? If you are cognizant of calling out the folly in the left, then we have to be prepared to call out the folly in the extreme right as well. And that's where truth is always a balancing act. And when people lose faith in the government, they go to extremes. And that's why we see, bringing this back to the beginning of our program, the rise of the wrong Christian nationalism. And I don't want to say the wrong. There isn't a right Christian nationalism if you understand the definition correctly, not the definition that the MSNBC lady gave, right? And so that is the danger. When there's a vacuum, you start going to extremes. Hey, I want to end on a funny meme, but go ahead.
Okay, so I agree with your point. Only push back in this. There is a good kind of extremism. There is, right? Barry Goldwater, I think it was the 1964 presidential campaign, he said, extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
Yes.
So that's
But you know what I mean? Go ahead.
But here's the thing. This is the kind of extremist we should be. And this is the point I'll end my thoughts on is, listen, the best ideas, right? We can be proud about the ideas upon which this country was founded, right? We can be proud patriots. And listen, we should be zealots for liberty of conscience. That means liberty rightly understood, right? That's not the liberty to the way the left does it, to screw anything that moves, but true liberty, political freedom, right? Religious freedom, right? And let's be zealots for that. Let's be extremists in the defense of liberty, right? Let's not try to persecute our leftist neighbors who don't agree with us, right? Let's not try to get retribution and vengeance, just justice.
Yes.
Truth, justice, and the American way, to quote Superman.
Mercy. Look at this. I saw this a couple of weeks ago, and I saved it. And this is what I think of what I like to say to some of my extreme liberal friends. Look at this. How to politely tell someone they're stupid. Wisdom has been chasing you, but you have always been faster.
Uncle Iro.
Oh, man. Look, Joey, I really enjoyed the conversation today. Sometimes we sound like a broken record, right? But truth doesn't change, right? Truth that is grounded on God's word, truth that is grounded on principles that are everlasting are never going to change. And we have to call it out when we see it in foolishness, like the lady from the MSNBC. And we even showed Uncle Joe Biden believing the way we used to believe. Believing the way we believe that he used to believe. But people, as the Bible says, are tossed to and fro in all directions, going with the whim of the crowd, with what's popular. And what's popular is never, 99.999% of the time, is never going to be aligned with the truth. I'll give you the closing word.
Yeah, no, my closing thought is dive into our founding documents, right? And if you have kids, right, make sure they know this stuff, right? Because the kind of civic illiteracy that we saw there, where you can get somebody on a mainstream news network and say something so ridiculous, like it just shows that there's civic illiteracy. So we've got to be, let's cure that. The cure for illiteracy is information. So that's what I would say.
Or
Arm
like,
yourself with truth.
Or like I grew up with the commercials in the 80s and 90s, riff. Reading is fundamental, people. Read, 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 read. Don't get your news from YouTube or even from our show. Read, and then you'll see that Joey and I are dropping truth bombs. Until next time, God bless you all, and thank you for watching the Gio and Joey show. Take care.